My phone's GPS had given up 20 minutes ago, leaving me to navigate the last stretch of winding back roads with nothing but Harold's handwritten directions and a growing certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake. The gravel crunched under my tires as I followed what barely qualified as a driveway, weaving between towering oaks that seemed to close in around my car like they were trying to swallow the path entirely. 3 hours of driving through rural Virginia had brought me here, to a place I'd never imagined I'd end up. 2 months ago, I'd been working at a marketing firm in Richmond, complaining about deadlines and office coffee. Now I was unemployed, nearly broke, and about to move into a house owned by a great uncle I'd met exactly once when I was 7 years old. The property emerged from the trees like something out of a Gothic novel. The 2-story house stood weathered and gray, its paint peeling in long strips that fluttered in the breeze like dead skin. Shutters hung crooked on their hinges, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of years and neglect. Wild vines had claimed the lower half of the building, creeping up the walls with an aggressive determination that made the whole structure look like it was being slowly consumed by the forest around it. I parked near what used to be a front walkway, now mostly hidden under a carpet of fallen leaves and sprouting weeds. The silence hit me as soon as I turned off the engine. No traffic, no neighbors, no sounds of civilization at all. Just the whisper of wind through branches and the distant call of some bird I couldn't identify. Getting out of the car felt like stepping into another world. The air smelled different here, thick with the scent of moss and damp earth and something else I couldn't place. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. I grabbed my first box from the trunk and walked up to the front door, fishing the key from my pocket. The key turned easily, which surprised me. I'd expected rust and resistance, but the lock clicked open like Harold had oiled it recently. The door swung inward with a long creak that echoed through the empty house. Inside, dust particles danced in the shafts of afternoon light streaming through grimy windows. Every piece of furniture was draped in white sheets, giving the place the feel of a museum or a tomb. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I walked through the front hallway, past a steep staircase and into what looked like a living room. Everything felt frozen in time, like Harold had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any minute. I set the box down on a sheet-covered couch and walked toward the back of the house. The kitchen was small and outdated, with yellow linoleum floors and cabinets that had seen better decades, but it was clean, and more importantly, it had running water and electricity. After the past 2 months of uncertainty, even this felt like a luxury. That's when I saw the note. It sat in the exact center of the kitchen table, a single piece of paper covered in careful handwriting. My name was written across the top in block letters, Emily Carter. I picked it up, recognizing the same neat script from the directions he'd mailed me along with the key. The paper felt old and slightly yellowed, like it had been sitting there for weeks. Emily, if you're reading this, then I'm dead and you've inherited this property. I'm sorry for that. Not sorry that you've inherited it, but sorry that you'll have to deal with what comes with it. This place isn't like other places. There are rules you need to follow if you want to stay safe. I've lived here for 37 years, and these rules are the only reason I survived as long as I did. 1. Never enter the woods after dark. 2. If you see lights or hear voices from the forest, ignore them completely. 3. Don't eat anything that grows in the garden. 4. Never dig in the garden no matter what you think you see. 5. If anything from the garden gets inside the house, get it outside immediately. 6. Keep all doors and windows locked from sunset to sunrise. I know this sounds crazy. I know you probably think I was just a paranoid old man who lived alone too long. You're half right. I was old, and I did live alone. But I wasn't paranoid. I was careful. There's a difference. Follow the rules, Emily. Your life depends on it. Harold. I read the note twice, then set it down and stared at it. 6 rules for living in a house. Not suggestions or recommendations, but rules, written with the kind of serious precision you'd expect from someone writing a will or a confession. My first instinct was to laugh. My great-uncle, the hermit who'd lived alone in the woods for decades, had left me a list of supernatural safety precautions like something out of a bad horror movie. Don't go in the woods at night. Don't talk to voices in the forest. Don't eat the vegetables. It read like the kind of thing you'd find in a ghost story, not a real inheritance. But Harold had been serious when he wrote this. Every letter was carefully formed, every word chosen with intention. This wasn't the rambling of someone losing his mind. This was methodical, deliberate. He'd taken time with this note, probably rewritten it several times to get it right. I folded the paper and stuck it in my pocket. Whatever Harold's reasons for writing these rules, I had bigger problems to worry about, like the fact that I had less than $200 in my checking account and nowhere else to go. Like the fact that my former boss had made it clear that my references would be less than glowing after I'd questioned his expense reports a little too publicly. Like the fact that this isolated house in the middle of nowhere was literally my only option for shelter. So Harold thought the woods were dangerous at night. Fine. I wasn't planning on wandering around in the dark anyway. And the garden rules seemed harmless enough. Don't eat random plants and don't go digging around. Basic common sense, really. The door locking rule was just good security practice, especially out here where the nearest neighbor was probably miles away. I spent the next few hours bringing in boxes and trying to make the place feel less like a mausoleum. I pulled the sheets off the furniture in the living room, revealing a worn but sturdy couch and a coffee table that looked handmade. The kitchen had everything I needed: an old but functional refrigerator, a gas stove that lit on the second try, and enough dishes and utensils for basic cooking. Upstairs, I found a bedroom with a decent mattress and a bathroom with hot water that ran rust-colored for the first minute before clearing up. By late afternoon, I'd made enough progress to feel like I might actually be able to live here. The house had good bones under all the neglect, and with some cleaning and basic maintenance, it could be comfortable. Not beautiful, maybe, but livable. I was arranging my books on a shelf in the living room when I noticed the view from the back windows. The house sat on a slight rise, giving me a clear view of the backyard and the woods beyond. Between the house and the tree line stretched Harold's garden, and calling it overgrown was an understatement. The garden had clearly been planned and cultivated at some point, but now it looked like nature had taken over and decided to get creative. Plants grew in impossible tangles. Vines twisted around each other in patterns that hurt to look at too closely, and flowers bloomed in colors that seemed too bright, too saturated to be natural. The whole area pulsed with growth so aggressive it looked almost alive, like I was watching it breathe. Vegetables and herbs mixed with wild plants I couldn't identify, creating a chaotic maze of green that stretched nearly to the edge of the woods. Some of the larger plants moved slightly in the breeze, but others swayed without any wind at all, as if they were responding to something I couldn't see or hear. I stood at the window for several minutes, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The garden should have been dead or dormant this late in the season, but everything looked vibrant and healthy, almost aggressively so. It was beautiful in a way that made me slightly uncomfortable, like staring at something that was trying too hard to get my attention. The longer I watched, the more I noticed small details that didn't quite make sense. The way certain plants seemed to cluster around specific areas, forming rough circles or lines. The way the colors shifted subtly when clouds passed over the sun. The way the whole garden seemed to pulse with a rhythm that reminded me ridiculously of a heartbeat. I shook my head and stepped away from the window. 2 days of stress and uncertainty were making me imagine things. It was just an overgrown garden, neglected by an old man who'd lived alone too long. The strange colors were probably just unfamiliar varieties of plants, and the movement was just wind and my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But as I walked back to my unpacking, I found myself glancing toward the back windows again and again, drawn by the hypnotic rhythm of that impossible garden pulsing just beyond the glass. I'd managed to make the living room feel almost normal by evening. The sheet-covered furniture was gone, replaced by my own books on Harold's shelves and a throw blanket I'd brought from my apartment draped over the couch. The old house had character, I told myself as I settled in with a paperback mystery novel. Character was just another way of saying it made noise. The creaking started as soon as the temperature began to drop. Every beam and board in the place seemed to have its own voice, groaning and settling as the wood contracted in the cooling air. I'd grown up in newer houses where the loudest nighttime sound was the hum of the refrigerator, but Harold's place apparently liked to announce every change in the weather. I tried to focus on my book, but my attention kept drifting to the sounds around me. A sharp crack from upstairs made me look toward the ceiling. A long groan from somewhere in the walls had me glancing toward the kitchen. The house felt alive in a way that was both comforting and unsettling, like it was adjusting to having someone new inside its walls. By 11:30, I'd read the same page 3 times without absorbing a word. The constant symphony of settling wood was getting to me more than I wanted to admit. Every creak sounded deliberate, purposeful, like footsteps or doors opening. I turned on Harold's old television, finding a late-night talk show that filled the room with familiar voices and canned laughter. That helped. The TV created a buffer of normalcy, drowning out the more subtle house sounds and giving me something concrete to focus on. I curled up in the corner of the couch, pulling my blanket around my shoulders and letting the mindless chatter wash over me. For the first time since arriving, I felt like I might actually be able to sleep here. The voice came just after midnight. Emily. I heard it clearly through the television noise, soft but distinct, drifting in from somewhere behind the house. My entire body went rigid. The voice was calling from the direction of the woods, just like Harold had warned about in his note. But this wasn't just any voice. Emily, honey. My book slipped from my hands and hit the floor. That tone, that particular way of saying my name. I hadn't heard it in 5 years, but I recognized it instantly. The same gentle inflection my mother had used when she'd call me down for breakfast or check on me when I was sick. My mother's voice. I sat frozen on the couch, Harold's second rule echoing in my head. If you see lights or hear voices from the forest, ignore them completely. But the voice calling my name was so familiar, so perfectly right, that every logical thought in my brain was being drowned out by pure emotion. Emily, where are you? The voice came again, clearer this time, with just a hint of worry that made my chest tighten. It was exactly how my mom had sounded when she couldn't find me in the house. That mix of concern and affection that had always made me feel safe and loved. My hand moved toward the back door without my conscious permission, my body responding to 5 years of grief and longing. I caught myself before I reached the handle, forcing my arm back to my side. Harold's rules. Don't respond to voices from the forest. But this was my mother's voice, calling for me in the darkness, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to answer. Emily, I need to talk to you. The plea in those words nearly broke me. It was the same tone she'd used during our last real conversation, when she'd tried to convince me to visit more often. When she'd worried about me working too much and not taking care of myself. When she'd said she just wanted to know I was okay. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the voice seemed to bypass my fingers entirely, speaking directly into my mind with that perfect maternal warmth I'd been missing for years. I know you lost your job, honey. I know things have been hard. My breath caught. How could it know about that? How could anything in those woods know about the past 2 months of unemployment and rejection letters and slowly draining bank accounts? But the voice continued with the same patient understanding my mother had always shown when I was struggling. Come outside, Emily. Let me help you. I was crying now, tears streaming down my face as I fought against every emotion the voice was triggering. My hand reached for the door handle again, desperate to run outside and find my mother in those dark woods, desperate to tell her about losing my job and how scared I was, and how much I missed having someone who cared about me. The rational part of my brain kept screaming Harold's warning, but it was being overwhelmed by 5 years of accumulated grief and the overwhelming need to hear my mother's comfort one more time. "Please, Emily, I've been waiting for you." The sadness in that voice was devastating. It carried the weight of missed conversations and holidays spent alone, and all the things I'd never gotten to say before the accident. My mother, calling for me in the darkness, asking me to come to her when I needed her most. I turned up the television volume, the talk show host's cheerful banter now sounding harsh and artificial compared to the gentle voice outside. But even with the TV blaring, I could still hear her calling my name, sometimes pleading, sometimes crying, each word designed to tear the exact wounds I'd been carrying since her death. For 20 minutes, the voice continued its emotional assault. It knew exactly what to say, exactly how to sound like the woman who had raised me and loved me unconditionally. It told me she missed me, that she was proud of me, that everything would be okay if I just came outside. It used phrases she'd actually said, inflections I remembered from childhood, private jokes only the two of us had shared. I sat on that couch with my hands clamped over my ears, sobbing and shaking as I fought against the most powerful emotional manipulation I'd ever experienced. Every fiber of my being wanted to run outside and find my mother in those woods, but Harold's words kept echoing through my mind. "Follow the rules, Emily. Your life depends on it." Gradually, almost reluctantly, the voice began to fade. The calls became more distant, the tone more desperate, as if whatever was making that sound was being pulled deeper into the woods against its will. The last thing I heard was my name, spoken with such heartbreaking longing that I nearly got up from the couch to chase after it. Then silence. I sat there for another hour, trembling and wiping tears from my face, waiting to see if the voice would return. The television continued its mindless chatter, but the house around me felt different now, charged with something I couldn't name. The creaking sounds that had bothered me earlier now seemed protective, like the house itself was standing guard against whatever had been calling from the woods. Harold's rules weren't the paranoid ramblings of an isolated old man. They were survival instructions written by someone who had lived with these dangers for decades. Someone who understood that the woods behind this house contained something that knew exactly how to find your deepest wounds and use them against you. I turned off the television and sat in the quiet darkness, finally understanding that my great-uncle hadn't been crazy at all. He'd been careful. And if I wanted to survive here, I'd need to be just as careful as he had been. The day had passed quietly enough, which somehow made me more nervous than if something had actually happened. I'd spent most of it organizing Harold's books and trying not to think about what I'd heard the night before. Every time my mind wandered to that voice, my mother's voice, calling from the woods, I forced myself to focus on something concrete. Alphabetizing novels, dusting shelves, checking the locks on doors and windows. By evening, I'd drawn all the curtains in the house and positioned myself as far from the back windows as possible. The living room felt safer with the television on and a lamp casting warm light across Harold's furniture. I'd made myself dinner and eaten it while watching a cooking show, keeping my back firmly turned to the kitchen and its view of the garden. But around 11, curiosity started gnawing at me. I told myself I was just being practical. If something dangerous was happening outside, shouldn't I know about it? Harold had lived here for 37 years by being careful, not by hiding from everything. Maybe part of being careful meant staying aware of what was out there. I walked into the kitchen, telling myself I'd just take a quick look to make sure nothing was wrong. The curtains were heavy fabric, probably older than I was, and they blocked out everything beyond the glass. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering near the edge of the material. One quick look, just to check. I pulled the curtain aside about an inch and peered through the gap. Deep in the woods, maybe 50 yards back from the tree line, A soft blue light was glowing between the branches, not harsh or bright like a flashlight, but gentle and warm, pulsing with a steady rhythm that reminded me of breathing. The color was unlike anything I'd ever seen, not the cold blue of LED lights or the electric blue of neon signs, but something organic and alive. The light was beautiful. I opened the curtain wider, pressing my face closer to the glass. The glow moved slowly between the trees, drifting from left to right in a lazy pattern that looked almost like it was searching for something. Each pulse sent ripples of blue illumination through the surrounding branches, creating shadows that danced and shifted in mesmerizing ways. Without realizing it, I'd opened the curtain completely and was standing fully at the window, both hands pressed against the glass. The light seemed to notice my attention, pulsing a little brighter, a little faster. It was calling to me, though not with words like the voice had done. This was different. A pull I felt in my chest, a yearning that made me want to walk outside and follow that gorgeous blue glow wherever it wanted to lead me. I found myself moving toward the back door. My hand was reaching for the handle when Harold's voice echoed in my head. If you see lights or hear voices from the forest, ignore them completely. The second rule. The one I'd almost broken less than 24 hours after reading it. I jerked my hand back and stepped away from the door. But I couldn't stop looking at the light. It continued its slow dance through the trees, each pulse sending waves of longing through my body. The blue was so pure, so perfect, that staring at it felt like looking at something sacred, something meant for me specifically. The rational part of my brain kept repeating Harold's warning, but the rest of me was being drawn toward that glow like metal to a magnet. My feet had moved me back to the door without my permission. My hand was on the handle again. All I had to do was turn it, step outside, and walk toward the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I forced myself back to the kitchen table and sat down hard in one of Harold's wooden chairs. From there, I could still see the light through the window. Still feel its pull, but at least I wasn't touching the door handle anymore. For an hour, I sat at that table and watched the blue glow move through the woods. It never came closer to the house, never grew brighter or dimmer, just maintained that steady, hypnotic pulse that made me want to join it. The longer I stared, the stronger the compulsion became. My legs twitched with the need to stand up and walk outside. My hands clenched and unclenched as I fought the urge to open the door. The light was calling to something deep inside me, something that had nothing to do with logic or self-preservation. It felt like being homesick for a place I'd never been, like missing someone I'd never met. The blue glow promised answers to questions I didn't even know I was asking, solutions to problems I couldn't name. I realized my cheeks were wet. I was crying without having felt the tears start, my body responding to the light's call with an emotional intensity that surprised me. The sadness wasn't painful like it had been with my mother's voice. This was different. A gentle melancholy mixed with hope, like the feeling you get when you remember something wonderful from childhood that you can never experience again. Every few minutes, I caught myself standing up from the table, ready to walk outside and follow the light deeper into the woods. Each time I forced myself to sit back down, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles went white. Harold's rules weren't suggestions. They were survival instructions written by someone who'd faced these same temptations for decades. But the light was so beautiful, so peaceful. How could something that gorgeous be dangerous? That thought scared me more than the compulsion itself. The voice had used my grief against me, manipulating my love for my mother to try to lure me outside. This light was doing something similar but subtler, appealing to a longing I couldn't even define. It was beautiful because it was designed to be beautiful. Perfect because it needed to be perfect to draw people into the woods. I got up from the table and walked to the front of the house, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that mesmerizing glow. But even from the living room, I could feel it calling to me through the walls. The pull was weaker here, but still present, like a song playing just below the threshold of hearing. The rest of the night passed in a haze of restless pacing. I walked from room to room, avoiding the kitchen and its view of the woods, but unable to stop thinking about the blue light dancing between the trees. Every few minutes, I found myself walking toward the back of the house before catching myself and turning around. By 3 a.m, I was exhausted but couldn't sit still. The compulsion to go outside had settled into a constant ache, like being thirsty but not being allowed to drink. I tried reading, tried watching television, tried anything that might distract me from the knowledge that something beautiful and impossible was waiting for me in those woods. The light continued pulsing until dawn. I watched from the kitchen window as the first hints of sunrise began to creep through the trees, gradually washing out the blue glow until it faded completely. Only then did the compulsion finally release its grip on me, leaving me feeling empty and somehow incomplete. I spent the early morning hours sitting at Harold's kitchen table, understanding that I'd just experienced another form of supernatural manipulation. The voice had attacked my emotions directly, using my grief to try to draw me outside. The light had been more subtle, appealing to something deeper and harder to define. Both had been designed to make me break Harold's rules, and both had nearly succeeded. My great-uncle had lived with these temptations for 37 years. Night after night, he'd sat in this same house while beautiful, impossible things called to him from the woods. Night after night, he'd chosen safety over curiosity, caution over wonder. Now I understood why he'd become a hermit. It wasn't paranoia that had kept him isolated. It was discipline. The kind of discipline I'd need to develop if I wanted to survive here as long as he had. I'd barely slept after watching that blue light until dawn, but organizing Harold's books was helping me stay focused on something normal and productive. My hands were shaky from too much coffee and too little rest, but I kept pulling volumes from the shelves, checking their spines, and arranging them by subject. Harold had been a reader: mysteries, science fiction, local history, and what looked like several decades worth of gardening guides that I definitely wasn't planning to consult. The scratching started around 3 in the afternoon. At first I thought it was just another settling sound from the old house, but this was different, deliberate, rhythmic, coming from the direction of the back door. I set down the copy of Agatha Christie I'd been holding and listened more carefully. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Something was working at the door itself, not just brushing against it. The sound had a purposeful quality that made my exhausted brain snap to attention. I walked toward the kitchen, moving slowly, trying to stay quiet despite the groaning floorboards. Through the back window I saw them. 3 small figures crouched at the door, roughly the size of children, but wrong in every possible way. Their skin looked like bark, not smooth like a tree trunk, but rough and ridged, like the twisted surface of an old oak. Where their eyes should have been were hollow sockets filled with a soft, sickly green glow that pulsed like the moss was alive and breathing. Their limbs bent at angles that made my stomach turn. Arms that curved backward at the elbows, legs that twisted sideways at the knees, fingers that extended too long and split into root-like tendrils instead of ending in normal human digits. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like marionettes being controlled by someone who didn't quite understand how joints were supposed to work. But their faces were the worst part. Vaguely human in shape, I could see the basic structure of a nose, cheekbones, a chin, but stretched and distorted like clay that had been molded by someone who'd only heard humans described secondhand. Their mouths opened far wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of sharp brown points that looked more like thorns than teeth. One of the creatures was using its root fingers to work at the door lock, probing and scraping with a patience that suggested it had done this before. The other 2 had moved to the windows on either side of the door, pressing their faces against the glass and leaving muddy smears that carried the overwhelming smell of rotting vegetation. even through the sealed windows. I backed away from the kitchen, my heart hammering as I processed what I was seeing. These weren't just supernatural manifestations like the voice or the light. These were physical beings, solid enough to leave marks on the glass, determined enough to actually attempt breaking into the house. Harold's fifth rule echoed in my memory. Remove anything from the garden that gets inside the house. The implication had been clear. Garden things would try to get inside. I'd thought it was about plants growing through cracks or maybe insects. I hadn't imagined it meant creatures like these, beings that looked like they'd crawled out of some nightmare fusion of human remains and twisted vegetation. I moved through the house quickly, checking every door and window to make sure everything was locked. The front door, the side door that led to what used to be Harold's workshop, every window on the ground floor, all secure. The creatures outside seemed to sense my movement, and their chittering grew louder, a sound like insects mixed with human whispers that made my skin crawl. From the living room, I could still hear them working at the back of the house. The scratching became more intense, joined by a soft tapping that suggested they were testing different parts of the door and windows, looking for weak points. Occasionally, I heard a wet sliding sound that I didn't want to think about too closely. I found myself pacing between rooms, checking and rechecking the locks, peering through front windows to see if more of those things were approaching from other directions. The house felt smaller with them outside, like the walls were closing in while simultaneously being my only protection against whatever those creatures intended to do if they got inside. The chittering was the worst part. It had an almost conversational quality, like they were discussing strategy or sharing information about the house's defenses. Sometimes the sounds almost resolved into words, not quite, but close enough to make me strain to understand what they might be saying. Other times they dissolved into pure insect noise, clicks and buzzes that seemed to come from deep in their throats. After an hour, I heard new sounds, scraping against the siding like they were trying to climb the exterior walls. I went upstairs and checked the bedroom windows, making sure they were latched, but I couldn't see the creatures from that angle. They were directly below, working their way around the foundation of the house with the methodical thoroughness of professionals. The muddy prints they left on the glass grew thicker as the afternoon wore on, creating patterns that looked almost like writing in some alien script. The smell of rot grew stronger too, seeping through gaps around the window frames and filling the kitchen with the stench of things that had been buried too long and were now walking around in daylight. I tried reading to distract myself, but the constant sounds made concentration impossible. The creatures never stopped moving, never paused to rest, never seemed to get frustrated by their lack of progress. They approached the task of breaking into Harold's house with the same patient persistence I'd seen in the garden's growth patterns. Relentless, organic, unstoppable. Around 5 o'clock, one of them managed to work something loose. I heard a small metallic ping from the back door, followed by excited chittering from all three creatures. My exhausted nerves snapped, and I found myself in the kitchen before I'd consciously decided to move, staring through the window at the things clustered around my only exit. The one at the door had its root fingers deep in the lock mechanism, twisting and probing with movements that looked more like surgery than simple lock-picking. Dark fluid was leaking from where its fingers disappeared into the metal, staining the door frame with something that looked like tree sap mixed with blood. That's when I noticed their faces more clearly. The bark skin wasn't uniform. There were patches where I could see something pale underneath, something that looked disturbingly like human flesh. And their hollow eye sockets weren't completely empty. Deep in the green glow, I caught glimpses of what might have been actual eyes. Human eyes, staring out from whatever these things had become. I pressed myself against the kitchen wall as far from the windows as possible and focused on Harold's words. The house had protected him for 37 years. The locks had held. The rules had worked. These creatures were testing the defenses, but they hadn't broken through yet, and if I followed the same precautions that had kept Harold safe, they wouldn't break through now. The thought helped steady my nerves, but it also raised new questions. How often had Harold dealt with this? Had he spent decades listening to these things scratch at his doors and windows, knowing that one loose latch or forgotten lock could mean the difference between safety and whatever fate awaited people who let garden creatures inside their homes? The scratching continued for another hour, accompanied by increasingly frustrated chittering. The creatures moved around the house in a systematic pattern, testing every possible entry point with the thoroughness of experts. But as the afternoon light began to fade toward evening, their sounds gradually changed from determined to resigned. By the time the sun touched the tops of the trees, they were retreating. I watched through the front window as all three creatures emerged from around the sides of the house, moving with the same jerky, unnatural gait they'd used when approaching. They didn't look back at the house or make any threatening gestures. They simply walked across Harold's overgrown lawn toward the garden, their bark skin blending with the twisted plants until I couldn't tell where the creatures ended and the vegetation began. The garden seemed to welcome them back. Vines parted to create pathways, flowers turned to track their movement, and the chaotic tangle of growth shifted and rearranged itself to accommodate their return. Within minutes, they disappeared completely, absorbed back into the green maze that had probably created them in the first place. I spent the rest of the evening checking and rechecking every lock in the house, my hands still shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The muddy prints they'd left on the back windows were already drying, but the smell of rotting vegetation lingered in the kitchen like a reminder of how close they'd come to finding a way inside. Harold's rules weren't just survival instructions. They were battle plans, developed through decades of defending this house against forces that wanted very badly to get inside. Forces that were patient, intelligent, and absolutely determined to claim whatever they'd been seeking for all these years. I was beginning to understand that my great-uncle hadn't been a hermit by choice. He'd been a soldier, holding his ground against an enemy that never stopped attacking and never stopped evolving new ways to breach his defenses. Now that enemy knew someone new was living in the house, and based on what I'd seen that afternoon, they were very interested in meeting me. I'd managed maybe 2 hours of actual sleep before the sun dragged me back to consciousness. My eyes felt gritty and my head pounded from too much coffee and too little rest. But something had woken me up that wasn't the usual house sounds or my own anxious thoughts. The garden looked different. I could see it from my bedroom window upstairs, and even from that distance, something was clearly wrong. New shapes interrupted the chaotic tangle of growth, dark patches that hadn't been there when those creatures retreated yesterday evening. Rectangular patches that looked like fresh soil had been turned and mounded. I sat on the edge of Harold's bed, squinting through the grimy glass and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The morning light wasn't strong enough yet to reveal details, but there were definitely new disturbances scattered throughout the garden. 7 or 8 spots where the earth looked darker, higher, arranged in patterns that made my stomach clench with recognition. They looked like graves. I told myself I was being paranoid. The creatures had probably just damaged some plants while moving through the garden, leaving behind torn soil and trampled vegetation. Or maybe some larger animal had been digging for food. There were probably dozens of logical explanations that didn't involve anything supernatural or horrifying. But Harold's rules kept echoing in my head, particularly the ones about the garden. Don't eat anything growing there. Don't dig, regardless of what you think you see. Remove anything from the garden that gets inside the house. Rules that suggested the garden itself was dangerous, not just the creatures that lived in it. I made coffee with hands that shook more than I wanted to admit, then spent an hour trying to distract myself with Harold's books and yesterday's leftover dinner. But the rectangular patches of disturbed soil kept pulling my attention back to the kitchen window. Every time I glanced outside, they seemed more obvious, more deliberately arranged. By 9 o'clock, I couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. I knew it was stupid. Every instinct Harold had tried to give me said to stay inside, lock the doors, and pretend the garden didn't exist. But I needed to know what had changed overnight. Needed to understand what those creatures had been doing when they returned to their twisted habitat. I found a pair of Harold's work boots by the back door and laced them tight over my socks. The leather was cracked and stained with what looked like years of garden soil, but they fit well enough. I checked the door lock 3 times before opening it, making sure I could get back inside quickly if needed. The smell hit me immediately, not just the rotting vegetation I'd grown used to, but something deeper and more organic, something that made me breathe through my mouth and fight the urge to gag. The morning air was thick with it, sweet and putrid like flowers left in water for too long mixed with meat that had gone bad. A stone path led from the back door toward the garden's edge, barely visible under years of moss and creeping vines. I followed it carefully, keeping my steps light and my eyes on the disturbed patches of soil that looked even more ominous from ground level. The first one was maybe 20 feet from where the path ended. A rough rectangle of dark earth about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, mounded higher than the surrounding soil like something had been recently buried there. But as I got closer, I realized the earth wasn't staying still. The soil was shifting, moving, settling and rising like something underneath was trying to push its way to the surface. I took another step closer, my boots squelching in ground that was softer and damper than it should have been after days of clear weather. The mounded earth continued its slow, rhythmic movement, and I caught a glimpse of something pale poking through the dark soil. Fabric, rotted and stained, but definitely fabric. My stomach lurched as I understood what I was looking at. This wasn't just disturbed earth. It was a grave. A shallow grave that was slowly exposing its contents as the ground rejected whatever had been buried there. I forced myself to look around the garden more carefully, counting the rectangular patches I'd seen from upstairs. 7 of them. 7 graves scattered throughout Harold's overgrown garden, each one in the process of revealing what lay beneath the soil. The plants growing around the graves were different from the chaotic tangle I'd observed before. These were focused, purposeful, clustered around each burial site like they were feeding on what lay rotting underneath. Thick vines pulsed with visible fluid flowing through them, their surfaces slick and organic. Flowers opened and closed with a rhythm that looked disturbingly like breathing, petals wet and glistening in the morning light. I moved closer to the nearest grave, staying on the stone path but leaning forward to get a better look. The pale fabric was part of a shirt or dress, so degraded by time and moisture that I couldn't tell which. But there was more than just clothing visible now. The shifting soil had exposed what looked like the curve of a ribcage, yellowed bone that gleamed wetly in the dappled sunlight. A sound escaped my throat, part gasp, part sob, as I realized I was staring at human remains. Not recent remains, but old ones, buried here years or maybe decades ago, and now being slowly uncovered by earth that seemed to have a will of its own. I backed away from the grave, but my eyes kept moving to the others scattered throughout the garden. Each one showed similar signs of exposure, glimpses of bone, scraps of rotted clothing, the unmistakable shapes of human skulls pushing through the dark soil. The plants around each burial site grew thicker and more aggressive, their roots probably intertwined with whatever lay decomposing in the ground. This wasn't just a garden. It was an active burial ground, fed by human remains and tended by creatures that had once been human themselves. The things that had tried to break into the house yesterday weren't just supernatural manifestations. They were what happened to people who ended up buried in Harold's garden. The understanding hit me like a physical blow. My great-uncle hadn't been protecting me from abstract supernatural dangers. He'd been keeping me away from a place where people were murdered and buried, where their remains fed the soil that created new horrors to hunt for fresh victims. The sweet, putrid smell grew stronger as the morning sun warmed the garden. Flies buzzed around the exposed graves in clouds so thick they looked like smoke rising from the earth. The pulsing vines grew more agitated, their fluid-filled tubes beating faster like excited heartbeats. I turned and ran back toward the house, my feet slipping on the moss-covered stones as I fought to reach the safety of Harold's locked doors. Behind me, the garden seemed to sense my retreat, and the sounds it made changed from the usual organic rustling to something that sounded almost like disappointed sighs. I slammed the back door and turned the deadbolt with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. Through the kitchen window, I could see the graves continuing their slow exposure, revealing more bone and rotted fabric with each passing minute. The plants around them swayed without any wind, their breathing flowers opening wider as if they were hungry for whatever was decomposing beneath the soil. Harold's rules weren't just about avoiding supernatural forces. They were survival instructions for living next to a mass grave, a place where something had been systematically killing and burying people for years. The garden wasn't just alive. It was fed by death, sustained by human remains, and actively working to add new bodies to its collection. I sat at the kitchen table with my back to the window, finally understanding the true scope of what my great-uncle had been protecting me from. This property didn't just have supernatural dangers, it held secrets that were very real, very physical, and absolutely horrifying. 7 bodies, at least 7 people buried in that garden, slowly being exposed by earth that wanted to show me what it contained. 7 families somewhere who had probably never learned what happened to their missing loved ones. And I was living alone in a house that overlooked their graves, with nothing but Harold's rules standing between me and whatever had put them there. I couldn't stay here another hour. The realization hit me with absolute clarity as I sat at Harold's kitchen table, my back turned to those graves shifting and settling in the morning light. My financial problems were real, but they were problems I could solve. Getting another job might take months. Burning through my savings might leave me broke. But those were normal human difficulties. What I'd discovered in that garden was something else entirely. I started with the bedroom, throwing my clothes back into the same duffel bag I'd unpacked just days ago. My hands moved automatically, folding shirts and rolling jeans while my mind processed what I'd seen. Harold's note made complete sense now. Those rules weren't paranoid ramblings. They were survival instructions for living next to a killing ground. My great-uncle had spent 37 years following them because the alternative was ending up buried in that garden, becoming fertilizer for whatever unholy ecosystem had taken root on this property. I moved through the house methodically, collecting my books from Harold's shelves and packing my few kitchen items back into cardboard boxes. The silence felt different now, charged with new meaning. Every creak and groan of the old house sounded like a warning, urging me to hurry before something decided I'd seen too much to be allowed to leave. The thought made me pack faster. I had no idea what rules governed this place, what invisible boundaries I might have crossed by discovering those graves. Harold's instructions were about staying safe while living here, but they didn't cover what happened when someone decided to run. My laptop and chargers went into my messenger bag along with the few papers I'd brought. I left Harold's furniture and appliances exactly where I'd found them, taking only what I'd arrived with. The house could keep its secrets and its inherited horrors. I wanted no connection to this place that couldn't be severed by simply driving away. The worst part was loading my car. Each trip from the house to my Honda required walking past the kitchen window, where I could see the garden continuing its grotesque revelation. More bones were visible now, scattered among the plants like decorations. The rectangular patches of disturbed earth had grown larger, exposing rib cages and femurs and what looked like a complete human skull grinning up through the dark soil. I kept my eyes focused on my car trunk, cramming boxes and bags into every available space. The Honda wasn't built for moving, but I managed to fit everything by shoving my duffel bag into the back seat and balancing my laptop case on top of a box of books. As I carried the last bag, my toiletries and the few groceries I'd bought, from the house to the car I noticed movement in the garden. movement. They were emerging in broad daylight. The same creatures that had tested Harold's locks and windows yesterday were rising from the twisted vegetation, but the afternoon sun revealed them in horrible detail. What I'd taken for bark-like skin was actually a mixture of plant matter and human remains fused together in ways that made my stomach clench. Bone was visible through gaps in their vegetative covering, pale ribs poking through moss and vines, finger bones extending from root-like hands, skulls partially hidden by clusters of leaves and small flowers. Their hair was the worst part. Human hair, recognizable in color and texture, but intertwined with trailing vines and patches of moss that grew directly from their scalps. Some of them had strands of brown or blonde or gray hanging down their backs, moving with an organic rhythm that had nothing to do with wind. They moved with that same jerky, unnatural gait I'd seen before, but now I understood why. These weren't just supernatural beings. They were human corpses transformed by whatever force controlled the garden, animated by roots and vines that had grown through their bones and nervous systems. Walking dead, powered by plant matter, held together by vegetation that fed on their decomposing remains. I threw the last bag into my car and slammed the trunk, my hand shaking as I fumbled for my keys. More creatures were emerging from different parts of the garden, dozens of them, moving toward the house with purpose that suggested they knew I was leaving. I started the Honda and put it in reverse, backing quickly away from the house as the first of them reached Harold's overgrown lawn. In my side mirror, I could see them spreading out around the property's perimeter, positioning themselves like they were preparing to reclaim territory I'd temporarily occupied. The driveway felt longer than it had when I'd arrived. Every bump and pothole jarred my already frayed nerves as I accelerated down the dirt road, gravel spraying behind my tires. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, watching the house shrink in the distance, while more creatures emerged from the garden to join their companions. By the time I reached the first curve in the driveway, they were piling against Harold's windows and doors. Not trying to break in like they had yesterday, but pressing themselves against the glass and wood like they were trying to get inside now that the house was empty. Their movements had changed from predatory to possessive, like they were reclaiming something that belonged to them. The garden itself looked different too, writhing with new energy that made the chaotic tangle of growth pulse and shift in ways that hurt to watch directly. Whatever I'd awakened by discovering those graves had spread through the entire ecosystem, energizing the plants and creatures with a vitality that seemed to feed on my departure. I took the final curve before the main road and lost sight of the house, but I could feel it behind me, that entire twisted landscape breathing and moving with renewed purpose. The Honda's engine strained as I pushed it faster than was safe on the narrow dirt road, desperate to reach pavement and the normal world beyond Harold's property line. When I finally reached the intersection with the county road, I stopped and looked back one last time. The trees blocked my view of the house and garden, but I could see dark shapes moving through the branches. More creatures, probably, spreading through the woods or returning to whatever lair they used when they weren't testing Harold's defenses. The property would continue claiming victims. Someone else would eventually inherit it, or developers would buy it, or hikers would stumble across it. Normal people who didn't have Harold's note, who wouldn't understand the rules or recognize the dangers until it was too late. The garden would keep growing, the creatures would keep hunting, and more graves would appear among the twisted plants. I turned onto the county road and drove toward town, already planning to never speak of what I'd witnessed. Who would believe me? And even if someone did, what could be done? Call the police and tell them about walking corpses and supernatural gardens? Report the graves and watch investigators disappear into the same ecosystem that had created them? Harold had been the guardian of something that should never have existed, and now that guardian was gone. I was driving away from a horror that would continue unchecked, but I was also driving toward a future where I might actually survive to see next week. My financial problems felt manageable now. Unemployment and debt were human-sized difficulties that could be solved with persistence and time. What I'd left behind in that garden was something else entirely. An ancient evil that had taken root in Virginia soil and would keep feeding until someone found a way to stop it. But that someone wouldn't be me. I was just grateful to be alive and driving away, with Harold's Honda carrying me toward whatever normal life I could still salvage from the wreckage of the past few days.